Imagine travelling in comfort from Sydney to Melbourne in 3 hours without having to leave the ground. There would be no airport delays, arduous security checks, necessary refueling, awful plane food, and of course, no contending with traffic in a taxi to leave or arrive home. Mid-20th century, a similar campaign existed to promote plane travel for work and leisure and has remained the standard paradigm. Never before has time and space been so compressed to allow the easy mobility of goods, services, and people. However, new challenges lay before us, and yet a multifaceted solution already exists to our transportation problems. High-speed rail is the flavor of the 21st century. Japan installed the Shinkansen bullet train in the 1960s, France in the TGV in the 1980s, and now China is actively expanding its network. Governments are serious about it, but why? At present, most developed economies are experiencing the fallout from a debt crisis. Historically, investment in infrastructure has created job security in the interim while providing a foundation for future growth. The USA-directed Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe after World War II, and an example closer to home, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was a beacon of hope for Sydneysiders during the Depression. We affectionately know it as the coat hanger, but in those desperate years from 1923 to 1932, it was called the iron lung, a kind of mechanized breathing apparatus, for it breathed life into the economy. In the case of the USA, such an investment echoes the past. Their economy is in recession now, and funding promises are coming to fruition as part of a high-speed rail stimulus package for areas like the Midwest and California.
What we need then is a smart transportation system equal to the needs of the 21st century. A system that reduces travel times and increases mobility. A system that reduces congestion and boosts productivity. A system that reduces destructive emissions and creates jobs. What we're talking about is a vision for high-speed rail in America.
Australia, on the other hand, is not in recession. In fact, it is the only OECD country not to experience one in the recent global financial crisis. The same rule applies, though. Invest in infrastructure and economic growth will be facilitated. The jury is out. Australia contends with Norway as having the best standard of living. City dwellers will tell you, though, the traditional quarter-acre block is shrinking. Our population is expected to reach 36 million by 2050 at expected birth and immigration rates. Australia is one of the most urbanized countries on Earth. Most of the population lives in cities by the coast. Major urban centres such as Sydney and Melbourne have absorbed population increase and consequently experience high levels of development, but are feeling the pressure of congestion, expensive housing, and so on. And regional areas tend to suffer by comparison, leading to lesser social mobility. It makes sense to take the pressure off our sprawling cities and increase the viability of dying regional towns. Time-efficient mass transportation will ease the burden on cities, revive overshadowed regional areas, and potentially create new towns en route in order to house a growing country. The tyranny of distance may well be conquered by high-speed rail in Australia. It is on the public agenda again in 2011 as Minister for Transport Anthony Albanese spearheads the campaign. The Federal Department of Infrastructure and Transport is examining the viability of high-speed rail links along the eastern seaboard of Australia, connecting capital cities Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, and possibly Adelaide. This is not a novel idea. Interestingly, local and international private interests have seriously backed the installation of high-speed rail in Australia in the past, and proposals have generally received bilateral support from state and federal governments. However, It is the exorbitant cost of such projects and the commitment to funding which has stymied progress. Australia's small economy of scale, that is, the cost predicament of a relatively small population having to cover large distances, has long prevented previous governments and private investors from manifesting proposals. Compare this to the USA. A 300 million strong population, geographically spread, means better viability, but construction perhaps somewhat harder. Future economic and population growth will inevitably impact on the environment in terms of emissions, pollution, and encroachment onto agricultural and wilderness areas. In signing the Kyoto Protocol, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd committed Australia to a reduction in carbon emissions. The USA has not, but its reputation as a hardcore emitter compels it to fulfill a moral obligation. The primary energy source for electricity generation in Australia is coal. Electrified rail installations, of course, means more carbon emissions. The Gillard government has legislated a carbon tax, leading to an emissions trading scheme. $15 billion will be invested in renewable energy annually. New renewable energy electricity plants will power rail infrastructure, potentially, therefore, no carbon emissions. Incidentally, a non-carbon energy source can even reduce carbon emissions, since less flights will be taken on already crowded routes such as Sydney to Melbourne, the fourth busiest air route in the world. Oil scarcity is a pressing issue and will detrimentally affect a famously good quality of life to which Australians have become accustomed. Oil scarcity poses an ominous threat to political stability. Air and motor vehicle travel viability will inevitably decrease into the future if Australians continue their dependency on oil. How will our politicians travel to Canberra if other sustainable solutions like fuel efficiency and non-fossil fuel modes of transport are not developed? As the Big Australia ideal is realised, environmental impact must not be overlooked. Growing populations and their attendant need for consumption and generation of waste requires land and resources. Will natural wilderness remain untouched and appreciated for its inherent value? Will agricultural land be overexploited and expanded to feed so many mouths? We go on to examine some unique issues born of this dilemma: waste management, endangered species, and agricultural sustainability.